Good afternoon. I'm Juliane Campfield. I'm the director of Deutsches Haus at NYU. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our panel Germany at the Poles between authoritarian populism and progressive politics, which we are absolutely delighted to co-present with our colleagues at NYU's Center for European and Mediterranean Studies with Thomas Zittel and Stephen Gross. Before I hand things over to Thomas Zittel, let me just thank our colleagues at SEMS and, of course, our speakers, Sheri, Berman, Thomas Gschwend, Thorsten Faas, Thomas Zittel, Stephen Gross, and Constanze Stelzenmüller. Thomas will introduce the speakers. The speakers will then present short statements. Thomas Zittel will then respond with a few questions, but you are very much invited to submit your own questions. You can do that through the Q&A button. If you're not familiar with how that works, you will find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says Q&A. You can put your question in there in writing, and Stephen will then read your question for the panelists and they can respond. After we have this Q&A with you, the audience, Stephen will provide closing remarks, and then we will all know what will happen at the German federal election on Sunday. That's not really the goal of the panel, but perhaps we'll have a better idea of the options. And in my personal polling among friends and family, I've never encountered as much uncertainty about what the outcome will be. Obviously, everybody believes it will be a coalition government, but nobody's quite sure what kind of coalition government. And there seems to be a long list of if, what, then that could happen. But perhaps everybody will be entirely wrong and it will be something different altogether. My thanks also go to the German Academic Exchange Service for their support of our academically inclined programs. And of course, I also want to thank the people behind the scenes, especially my colleague Sarah, but also Sasha, Tina, and Sarah, and Michaela Stein from SEMS for working on this event. Let me see if I need to announce anything else before I hand things over to Thomas Zittel, who will then introduce our distinguished panel in more detail. And my colleague Sarah will also post their more extensive biographical information in the chat for everybody to read if you want to learn more about what our distinguished panelists have done in the past. And I think that's it for me right now. Thank you for joining us, for your interest in our programs. And if you can vote in Germany, please make sure to vote on Sunday. Thank you, Thomas. The floor is all yours.
Good afternoon. My name is Thomas Zittel. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel list, which I will do in the order of the alphabet. Our first panelist is Sheri Berman. Sheri is a professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University. Sheri has published widely on European politics and is an internationally renowned expert in this field. She has just finished or is about to finish, I'm not sure, a fascinating book project with OUP about the development of democracy in Europe. That will be an exciting read, and I'm very much looking forward to reading that. But one of her main research emphasis is on a German political party that is currently experiencing a spectacular comeback after many years of misery and doom, namely the German Social Democrats. And we look forward to hearing from Sheri more about the reasons for this and what the implications might be. So welcome, Sheri. Our second panelist is Thorsten Faas. Thorsten is professor for comparative politics in the Department of Social Sciences at the Free University of Berlin. His research focuses, broadly speaking, on the political behavior and beliefs of citizens. Thorsten has made major contributions on the question how political communication is affecting the beliefs and behaviors of voters, This involves studies of him on the role of TV debates, but also on the role of candidate statements and media communication in general. One particular interesting question Thorsten has done work of is whether and how opinion polls affect the perceptions of voters in the campaign, which currently is a widely discussed topic in the German news. And we look forward to learning from him more about this issue, and also whether the two TV debates make a difference that for the first time involved three and not only two contestants on German television news. So welcome, Thorsten. Our third panelist is Thomas Gschwend. Thomas is professor for quantitative methods in the social sciences at the School of Social Sciences at the University of Mannheim. His research focuses on electoral behavior with a main emphasis on how electoral rules affect the behaviors of voters. Thomas is considered one of the great experts of strategic voting across Europe and US. And he is active in developing models to forecast elections in Germany. His current predictions are reported by the Süddeutsche Zeitung on a regular basis and also can be accessed via an own website. I need to emphasize that his past predictions were most accurate, to say the least. He even predicted the second red-green coalition after the 2002 elections against the consensus of most other published opinion polls. Therefore, I'm very confident that he can tell us which party will win next Sunday and what coalition will be formed. So we will be fully enlightened after this panel from his predictions. So welcome, Thomas. Our fourth panelist is Constanze Stelzenmüller. She's the inaugural holder of the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations in the Center on the United States and Europe at Brookings in Washington. Her areas of expertise lie in the field of transatlantic relations, German and European foreign policy, and also international law and human rights. In this, Constanze builds bridges between different fields and contexts in very unique and impressive ways. She has an academic background in law and public administration and worked as an editor at the German weekly Die Zeit, which is one of the most influential news outlets in Germany. She was with the German Marshall Fund and then joined Brookings. So she's really one of people who's building bridges in impressive ways. While reading more about her publications, I learned that she's characterizing German foreign relations as being driven by, and I quote, a deeply ingrained instinct to seek equally good relations with friends and foes. And I'm very much looking forward to hear her comment on the question how potential coalition prospects might affect transatlantic relations in this regard, and which ones may promise less transatlantic troubles than others. I again welcome you all, and I thank you for participating in this panel. And I now hand over to you and ask for your thoughts on the upcoming elections. I suggest that we keep the alphabetical order and start with Sheri. So Sheri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here and eager to hear what my colleagues have to say about Sunday and its consequences. So I'll start with actually something that Thomas mentioned, which is, sort of the position of the SPD, and also thinking about it in comparison to the position of the other mainstream party in Germany, the CDU-CSU. So the, sort of discussions of the decline of the SPD have been endemic now for several electoral cycles. This was a party like its counterparts in other European countries that not very, very long ago used to routinely poll in the high 30s, even if it was very fortunate, sometimes reaching in the low 40s, which enabled it to form coalition governments where it was very much the dominant partner and could therefore very much set the agenda. And so discussions of the spectacular rise of the SPD when it's polling in the mid-20s strikes me as a scholar of social democracy as really quite sad, because that is really not anything near what it historically had polled. And also, I think, the other issue is that the SPD lacks the sort of distinct profile that it would have had up through the 80s and 90s. What's interesting, of course, is that while we've been talking about the decline of the SPD and social democratic parties for quite some time now, it seems like the other mainstream party in Germany, the CDU-CSU, as well as its counterparts again in other European countries, mainstream center-right parties, has now fallen into the same pattern or trend that the social democrats on the center-left have, namely that this party has declined to something in the 20s, which renders it incapable of forming stable majority-like coalition governments. That is to say, where it is by far the dominant partner needing the help only, obviously, of a much smaller party to come to power. So we've seen this now decline in both of the mainstream parties. And I would argue actually that some of the reasons for the decline of the CDU-CSU do indeed parallel the reasons for the decline of the SPD and other social democratic parties, namely that the parties have lost a distinctive profile. This probably began in Germany with Schroeder and the watering down of the SPD's distinctive economic profile as a party very clearly of, sort of the underprivileged, the working class, that had something, again, resembling a left-wing economic profile. And then that was further watered down, obviously, by several grand coalitions with the CDU-CSU. And that this is kind of deadly for political parties, right? Which is voters no longer know exactly what it is that they stand for, making their ties to these parties much more conditional, much more tenuous. And I would say that, Merkel, for all of her many accomplishments, has done something very similar to the CDU-CSU, which is she's watered down its profile. She obviously moved it to the center, perhaps quite, sort of strategically initially, but, both on economic and social issues, it's now a different party in some significant ways than historically it had been. And the reflection of this very concretely in the campaign is that this is a campaign that is focused an awful lot on candidates rather than parties, right? So nobody, as far as I can tell, is discussing about how great the SPD's program is. The reasons for its spectacular rise are not because it has all of these great new ideas and these sort of fabulously new policies that are designed to address Germany's myriad challenges, but rather because Scholz seems to be the least offensive or problematic of the three candidates. And this is what happens when party profiles decline and voters have fewer or more tenuous party identities, which is they vote more on the basis of personalities than they do on the basis of programs. So that's the most striking thing, I think, about this election, particularly for an outside observer, the combination of the decline of the mainstream center-right and the accompanying focus on personalities rather than programs. And I would say that this is very problematic, not just for Germany, but for democracy more generally. What we're going to have, again, I think the polls, they can never be perfect, but they're not going to be that off. We're not going to get a center-right or a center-left party with 40% of the vote. I mean, that would be a spectacular fail, right? So we are going to get a coalition government in Germany, presumably with three parties. And that type of coalition government is very problematic, right? It's problematic because not only does it further water down the profiles of the participating parties, right? Who knows what's going on when there's three parties in government? Also, any of the potential combinations have some very significant problems. So the things that are being discussed are obviously SPD, Greens, and FDP. I don't get that one, right? Because the FDP's economic profile is really so problematic from the perspective of the SPD that it would force that party, I think, to make concessions that would only further damage it over the long term, since its raison d'etre, it's a social democratic party, is to be a party of the economic left, the party of the underprivileged, the party of the working class, the precariat, and how that's going to get done with the FDP in government, I don't see that at all. The other SPD option is SPD, Greens, and the left. To my mind, this makes much more sense, particularly from an economic perspective. There's not a huge amount of difference among the three parties on economic issues, or seriously much fewer differences. But the German party of the left has some very problematic views on foreign policy. We have an expert on foreign policy on this panel. And the right is trying to exploit that by saying that this kind of coalition would be extremely dangerous, yada, yada, yada. So that would create tensions. The other option, of course, is the CDU-CSU with the FDP and the Greens. That makes somewhat more sense from an economic perspective. But given that the Greens have really tried to expand their profile so that they are no longer a party simply of those obsessed with the environment, but have policy positions on a wider range of issues, I think this would be very problematic for them. And so any of these coalition governments, just like coalition governments composed of numerous parties in other European countries, without a dominant party that is able to really shape what that government does, I think this is very problematic from the perspective of political stability. And so I think any of the sort of obvious options that we have after the German elections are, sort of very problematic. Let me stop because my colleagues have lots of other interesting things to say with just mentioning the other sort of, elephant in the room, which is the AfD. Look, the AfD is not going to end up in a coalition at the federal level. However, it is sitting there with a pretty constant now 10+% of the vote. Given how deeply anchored it is in several parts of East Germany, that is probably not disappearing anyplace soon. Unlike its counterparts in some other European countries, places like France, Sweden come to mind, this party has not moderated over the last couple of years. It's still relatively young, but it has not moderated over the last couple of years, making coalitions with it much more problematic. Nonetheless, if the CDU-CSU ends up in that low 20 range and ends up out of government, we are obviously going to see a lot of pressure within the party to, if not join explicitly with the AfD, to adopt some watered down versions of its policies and perhaps to rely implicitly on support from the party in ways that hitherto have been frowned upon. And so, seeing what happens with the AfD election-wise in certain parts of Germany, again, I don't foresee a scenario where it ends up as part of a right-wing coalition. Nobody's talking about that. Laschet has made clear he wants nothing to do with that party. But nonetheless, if it ends up in the 10+ range and the CDU-CSU in the low 20s, there's just the math is going to make clear that some conversation about what to do about that party on the right is going to happen. And interesting will be if under those conditions, the AfD is forced to make itself more respectable in a way some of its right-wing populist counterparts in other European countries have done in response to the shiny goody that is more political power. So I'll stop there. I look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheri. So Thorsten, Faas is next.
Yes, thank you very much, Thomas. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here and share some thoughts about this really fascinating election. I'll start off with showing you some numbers maybe. And these numbers, even though they're very, very diverse, they only stem from the last couple of years. And just maybe have a look at these very, very different pictures. In June 2019, that was basically the timing of the European election. We've had the Greens in first place in German polls, 27%. The CDU-CSU at 24% in second place here. Social Democrats, we just heard about that, at just a mere 11%, just about 2 years ago. Just a year later, May 2000, we all of a sudden have the CDU-CSU at about 40%. In some polls, we have Greens and Social Democrats tied at about 15%, and other parties also with varying poll numbers here. Yet another year later, April 2021, we have the Greens back in first place. This is just after her candidate, Annalena Baerbock, was nominated. We have the CDU-CSU back then already in turmoil at 22%, and the Social Democrats still at a just mere 13%. And in August, so this bottom right figure is just about 4 weeks old, we have basically a tie of Social Democrats 23, Christian Democrats at 21, and the Greens at 18%. Why I'm showing this at the start of my presentation is just to give you an idea what kind of parliamentary term we have seen in Germany, one that has really been characterized by tremendous shifts, by an incredible amount of volatility. And the question, of course, arises, why have we seen this volatility? And I guess one could talk ages about this question. You could talk about candidates, the whole fact or the mere fact that we, for the first time ever, look for a new chancellor because Angela Merkel, as an incumbent, is not running. We could talk about issues, of course. We have seen the pandemic, which has given a tremendous boost to Merkel and the Christian Democrats in the year 2020. But we can also talk about coalitions, which are a very pressing and dominant issue in the current debate. I will focus on a few aspects of that, but let me finish this poll part of my presentation with the most recent one published this morning. There will actually another one be published tonight from the second German television network. So we all kind of excited to see those numbers, but this is the one that has been published this morning, published by YouGov. So right now, as of now, you have the Social Democrats pretty robust in the lead with 25%, Christian Democrats with 21%, Greens down to 14, AfD, you've heard that, at a stable 12, Liberals at 11, and the Left Party at 7%. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute when I talk about coalitions. But again, the whole idea of volatility can be traced to a number of factors, and we should maybe focus on that in the Q&A that we will have later on. But I think when you look at German politics, the developments of coalitions and also the presence of coalitions in debates that we have seen in the campaign, in debates that we have seen in the media, really has been a quite dominant picture. And why this is the case is because Germany has changed so much with respect to coalitions. This is the picture that you see when you look at the German states. So you have Germany consisting of the 16 Länder, the 16 states here. And as of now, you have 14 different coalition formats in those 16 German states. So basically, you could almost say that each of the 16 German states has its own coalition format. So now if you enter these final days of the campaign and you're a strategic voter, you might ask yourself, well, what do I do with that? And that's more complex than ever, to be honest. And because you as a voter have to basically make up your mind, well, what do I want? What is the coalition that I would like to see, given all the difficulties that we've already heard about? What would I like to see as the next coalition? What will be mathematically possible? What do parties say what they want? And to be honest, they don't say anything on this right now. Of course, they present some necessary requirements that they want to see fulfilled when they want to enter certain coalitions. But what they actually say is, we have to receive as many votes as possible so we can enter as a strong party all those talks that will be with us for the next actually weeks or months to come. And what do parties say? Well, I just mentioned that. If I go back to that poll that I've shown you before, the most recent one that has been published this morning, you actually see a number of different coalition formats that are mathematically possible. And again, this is something that is very, very new for German politics, and that media, public parties are really struggling with how to deal with that. You have a pretty strong majority of a coalition consisting of Social Democrats, SPD, Christian Democrats, CDU, CSU, and the Greens, Grüne, which would have about 60% of votes, and that would be a pretty stable majority in the Bundestag. Might even be a 2/3 majority in the Bundestag, which would have implications if we talk about constitutional changes, for example. You have other formats: Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, Liberals, with a stable majority, 57%. You have that SPD, Green, FDP coalition at 50%. And that's the fascinating thing about this poll that has just been published this morning, you have three other options that each receives 46% of the vote. That would be a very, very slim majority in each of those cases. So we might see some changes up until election day that might actually take the majority away from those coalitions. But that's the Christian Democrats, Greens, Liberal coalition. The Grand Coalition, which we have right now, consisting of Social and Christian Democrats, they do have a majority right now, which might have serious implications for all those talks that we will have after the election. And we also have, but again, a very, very slim majority for that left coalition that we already heard about. Given that Scholz has made pretty clear that a stable foreign policy is important for him, I don't really see how he would enter a coalition that has just such a slim majority, but we can talk about that, of course, later on. But what I'm trying to say here is that, of course, it's fascinating to see how this election day will play out, but it will be even more fascinating to see how all these developments, how all these talks and negotiations will play out that we will definitely have after election day, because this is a situation that we have never had before. There are no rules how this process will be organized. Will they talk pairwise at first? Will they talk in certain coalition formats? This will be really fascinating to see. But first of all, of course, we will have this election day on Sunday. The nervousness is tremendous right now, even though the polls have been pretty stable in recent days. The degree of nervousness, the question or the question of trustworthiness of polls is really, really present, and you can even grasp it. And the reason why that is the case, and that's my point in closing here, is that if you want to characterize the situation that we have right now in Germany, and if you transfer that to the question, how do voters make up their mind when they finally enter the polls or the voting booth on Sunday, you basically have a situation where we have a lot of talk about chancellor preferences. We have some talk about, does it matter whether you have government experience? The most pressing issue right now is no longer the pandemic, but according to polls, it's climate protection, climate change, and of course, coalition preferences matter as well. And if you look at German polls that we have, the situation is probably something like that most people want Olaf Scholz as the chancellor, but they also see that the Christian Democrats have a pretty stable and good record in just governing the country. Climate change is a green issue. The Greens have the competence here when you look at polls. And we also have these very different coalition preferences. So ultimately, all these issues are present in people's minds, at the same time. So the open question is, and that's why what makes the prediction of the outcome of this election so difficult is, what's actually at the end of the day the criterion that people will use when they actually cast their vote? If they for themselves decide that this is an election that's all about the next chancellor, well, then they will have to vote for the Social Democrats. If they think, well, times are difficult, maybe we want a government party that has the experience of running the country, that has been kind of a catch-all People's Volkspartei, that's able to integrate different cleavages or to bring together different perspectives, they might in the end up voting for the Christian Democrats. But if they think that this is the last election, and narrative that we hear quite often, the last election where we can determine the path sort of with respect to climate change, well, then they would have to make a vote choice for the Green Party. And we just don't know what the criterion will be that they will ultimately use on election day. And that's why I think this is a fascinating, but still basically very hard to predict election. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thorsten, for this very interesting statement for fresh data. And you picked up on Sheri's point on the big questions we probably come back to in the Q&A. Will there be a stable government after all, after these elections? So thank you very much. And Thomas goes next.
Hi, everybody. I have also some pictures. Thanks, Thomas, for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me. Thorsten really made a great summary of the situation we are facing right now in Germany in terms of the election. I want to make 4 points. Here's a graph which essentially gives you an overview over the election campaign and the polling of the parties in this year, right? You see, I think the striking one striking feature is that the CDU here in black was always at the top, but not here. So we had the Greens also at the top, and recently the SPD went to the top. So we have actually 3 viable parties who could actually run for the chancellorship, and this is something really new that we have in German election history. So we have typically 2 parties going for being chancellor, but not 3. And as Thorsten mentioned, there is no real incumbent. So it's really hard for people to make up their mind. And especially think about those voters who actually got used to the way Angela Merkel conducts her politics, how she's leading the country, and got accustomed to her and actually got to like her. I mean, people are really trusting her, right? They would buy a used car from her, no question, in no time. So they really like her, they trust her, and but these are lots of people who are not per se CDU voters. They vote for Angela Merkel. So they voted for the CDU previously because of Angela Merkel, and she's gone. So, it kind of shakes the system. So the people need to come to grips with, what am I going to do on election day? Okay, so we have, Thomas hinted at that, we have actually a forecasting model I'm part of a group of scholars. We work on a forecasting model. We started working on this, I think 5 years ago, and implemented this model for the last election. We're pretty successful doing this. And I want to show you some of the numbers we have right now. So these are our predictions. And one of the issues with our forecasts is that we want to make transparent how uncertain we are about those forecasts, right? So therefore, you see those bars. And those bars, each party's bar indicates the range of vote share that it has in a 5 in 6 chance in winning, right? So think about, rolling a dice. If you get a 6, that's can happen, but it's not all too likely. That's about this likelihood that you see. So the SPD has a 5 in 6 chance in getting between 18 and 27%. The SPD has a 5 in 6 chance in getting 21 to 33%, and so on and so forth. So we can see that there's still a likelihood quite some likelihood that the CDU actually ends up, if it ends up over here, then, no, you don't see it here. If it ends up over here, then this would be higher than if the SPD ends up over here. So there's still, a reasonable likelihood that the CDU could actually manage to come in first, okay? We also see that the left party might actually, there's a chance that they get below 5%, or even more especially the Greens are interesting. So they could actually beat the CDU. There's a small likelihood that they still beat the CDU for the second place. Okay, but what does this mean? Now we have those forecasts for election day. Our model includes, previous election results, some other historical data, some historical experience we have with polling data. We know historically that polling data in Germany is not too bad. It's not like in the US context. Maybe the quality of polling is better, or there are just more quality polls available. Our model combines actual polling, current polling data, and weighs down this polling data by some factors that are coming from a model with some historical trends we can model. Okay. Important for Germany is not so much, how much percent a particular party gets, because no party will get more than 50%. No party will get a likelihood of getting a majority of seats in parliament. So coalitions are necessary, right? And there is no formal rule, who actually will be the chancellor. It's not, I should say, there's a formal rule. Chancellor should have a majority in parliament, in the Bundestag, but that's about it. It does not say that the chancellor has to come from the strongest party, right? Could be that, and we had this in history. I think the last time, when was it? 76, I think. The CDU was the strongest party, and the SPD and the FDP formed a coalition, right? That's fair game. This works. So this is really hard to actually predict. So what our model, of course, can only do is to predict whether they get a majority in parliament, whether they are able to negotiate actually a coalition agreement. You need other models for doing this. And maybe in the next election, we actually combine our predictions of majority coalitions or potential majority coalitions in parliament to more substantively oriented models for predicting whether coalition agreements are actually formed. But our model, what does it predict? So we have currently a 99% chance for what is called the Germany coalition. So this is black, red, and yellow. Right? Politics in Germany is really colorful. It's almost like, so we have the CDU, SPD, and the FDP coalition. Because it's a German flag, it's called a Germany coalition. This is likely to have a majority. We have the Kenya coalition. It's also likely to have a majority, and the traffic light coalition. Red, yellow, and green. Has also a 95% chance of getting a majority. Okay, there are other coalition, and these are all three-party coalitions, right? Jamaica, this is CDU, Green, and the FDP, or we have a red, green, so it's the SPD, the Linke, and the Greens. They also still have a 72% chance of getting a majority in parliament. And even the CDU SPD, the current government, has even a 70% chance. Now, my sense is, given how hard it was to actually form this coalition in the first place, 4 years ago, and so my sense is, even if they get a majority, this is definitely not the first choice. So my sense is that. The model doesn't tell us whether they actually will form a government, but my sense is, if the election turns out as our model would predict, then it's probably likely that the traffic light coalition is of those coalitions are at least the first coalition they will probably try to form. Now, if this works, we don't know. As Sheri was indicating this, that the FDP. It's a little bit, we don't know what they're doing. And, actually we know what they're standing for, but they're sending really mixed signals. So it's really hard to predict how they would behave. But, 4 years ago, they essentially left coalition negotiations and told people it's better to leave now instead of governing or signing a bad coalition agreement. So this was not appreciated by their supporters. So my sense is that they don't have lots of leverage doing this again. So if they actually turn out to negotiate a coalition, they probably will give in at some point. Maybe they need to get the post of the finance minister for their party leader in order to sugarcoat this or something. Anyways. The last thing I want to highlight, not many people are talking about this, is the size of parliament. So our model, so we can predict the size of parliament. It's not a fixed size as in the US. And we have a quite involved, some would say quirky, election law. And so we have our model has predictions for each each electoral district here, and we see there are even some. We predict some AfD. So for the extreme right party, they will win some districts in Saxony, pretty much, in Brandenburg as well. But there will be, because there's a lot of black here, in Bavaria. This is the reason why we get lots of so-called surplus seats in our election law. And by law, there have to be some quite a number of compensatory seats, right? These are additional seats for each overhang seat, surplus seat. There are compensatory seats, and this is the reason why Parliament gets blown up. So our best guess for now is, more than 800 MPs in Parliament. No, wait a minute. You guys have 400 something, right? So we have almost double the size. That's just because we love politicians so much, I guess. Anyways, that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Your coalition prediction about the Green-Black coalition, which is now one of the least likely ones, and that used to be the most likely ones just 8 or 9 months ago, underscores the point Thorsten was making about this huge amount of volatility that we currently see, and that basically also not only confuses opinion poll people, but also average German voters quite a bit. So thank you very much. And now we turn to Constanze, who probably will talk more about also the policy implications of all this. So what does it actually mean that coalitions are so complex and so difficult to strike, and how will it affect policies and also foreign policies? Constanze, the floor is yours.
Yep. Well, thank you very much. I have to say this has been completely fascinating. And also actually completely terrifying in comparing basically confirming some of my worst fears about what this is going to look like. And let me explain why. What I've been saying here to my American friends and interlocutors and elsewhere in Europe is that we are looking at a situation where the least likely option is something that we know and are familiar with and that is in any way predictable in its policy outcomes. And so what we may be, in all likelihood, it's extremely probable that we will be looking at an extended period of introversion and negotiating. And that concerns me for a variety of reasons. The first one is that the last time we did that, and it failed, in 2017, it took 5 months to come to a new government, and that new government ended up being what we knew, which was a grand coalition. The only upside about that, I guess, is that the caretaker government that will be in charge in the meantime will be run by a very well-known quantity, which is Chancellor Merkel. And I think that relieves me a little bit, but only so far, because I do think that the Merkel government at this point is exhausted and its personnel is exhausted. And that's a matter of concern, given just the sheer intensity and the amount of crises that we've had, let's say just in the last 6 weeks, with Afghanistan and the blow up over the Australian submarine deal, where we've seen how much damage is done if people don't know each other, if the gears of personnel and policy making don't interlock within our countries, within Europe, and within the alliance. Terrifying. Second reason I have a problem with this is that this would bring us into collision with 2 other important electoral calendars, which is the French election in the spring and the American midterms in November of 2022. We all knew, we know now, that we have a very narrow time window in which to reaffirm fundamental tenets and common values and interests of the alliance and of the European Union under conditions of enormous and continuing stress, and in the expectation of further crisis. In other words, we have no time to waste. My third reason is that the life of foreign and security policy experts really has changed within the last decade. When I was a young person who knew nothing, the foreign and security policy tribe was a male priesthood, of which the top priests were the nuclear priesthood. There were very few women or other people, who couldn't be expected to be taken seriously. These elites basically sort of made decisions and policies and set the mood in a sort of closed bubble. That has changed completely. The strategic community, as it's called, is profoundly aware of the relevance of domestic issues for its ability to articulate policy and to implement it. And by that, I mean issues like infrastructure, digital and physical, which we used to be able to take for granted, I think, or we all took for granted. And not just the question of whether external powers are interfering with our infrastructure or buying it up, but the question of whether it is actually viable for keeping governance and the state in good working order. That's a real issue, and it has an impact on the foreign and security policy debate. The term we use is resilience. The second aspect, of course, of this is that we are keenly aware of the need to undertake genuine transformative change in the politics and the policies, not just of Germany, of Europe, but also the transatlantic alliance, if we are to be able to withstand coming shocks and crises. And finally, I think it is the last 4 years, particularly of the last term in Germany with the AfD and the Bundestag, has brought it home to all of us, in case we hadn't noticed, just how important democratic legitimacy is and how fragile it is for the making of viable, effective, and credible foreign and security policy. Now, I'm a constitutional lawyer by training, as you said, Thomas, and so I've been sort of thinking about this for a while, but I will say that until quite recently, if you said that kind of thing in my circles, you were considered as something of an oddity. Now, that brings me to foreign and security policy proper. I don't think it has escaped any of us, and in fact, it has certainly not escaped our allies and partners and friends and neighbors, that foreign and security policy played absolutely no role in the three big parliamentary debates, the Trielle, except for a 15-minute discussion of Afghanistan. I mean, if that scandalizes me, it mystifies our friends. And I think it's seen with interest by our rivals and adversaries. And contrast this with something that Jörg Lau has just pointed out in a front page article in this week's edition of Die Zeit, which I used to work for, which is that the Anglophone press has taken an enormous interest in German political debates. Extraordinary. Politico, The New Statesman, The Economist have all developed special dedicated web pages and election poll trackers for the German elections. That is how seriously we are taken outside of the country. And we're apparently not responding to that. And my sort of fourth and last point is about the candidates and the programs themselves. I've been reading the bloody party programs, and I have to tell you that this is a dispiriting exercise. It's not just Die Linke, Sheri, that appears to be living in another reality. I would say the same of the SPD party program. And I grew up in a family with parents who voted SPD because the CDU, when they were young, wanted parts of Poland back. And if you wanted to be a decent person, you didn't vote for the CDU, right? But honestly, it is shocking to me how much of the foreign and security policy chapter, which, by the way, in the SPD party program is discussed under the heading Europe's neighborhoods. It takes some guts to discuss Europe's neighborhood, to discuss China and Russia and America under the header Europe's neighborhood. I find that astounding. And the chapter itself is so thin and so devoid of sort of connection with current political realities that I am genuinely appalled. We could go into the details of other, as far as I'm concerned, if you read the Green program, which is enormous, it is an inflated grab bag of everybody's preferences in the Green Party and the Green base. And I think it is, above anything else, a testament to the fact that the Greens wanted to be inclusive, not hurt anybody by leaving them out, but were incapable of really bridging the quite considerable ideological and preferential differences that exist within the Green Party. That said, it certainly makes an attempt in important places to connect to modern challenges. And finally, on the candidates, I have to say that I do, and those of you who might have read a piece of mine in Foreign Affairs in spring about Merkel's legacy, I do think that with all the admiration that I have for Merkel, I think that the single greatest criticism I have of her tenure is that she did not prepare the country and the voters for the transformative changes ahead of us. In fact, if anything, she delayed them. And so my single most important question is whether any of the three candidates who want to succeed her or their parties are conscious of the need for these changes and are willing to make them. And frankly, I have serious doubts that Laschet is willing to do this. I have my doubts about Scholz. I think Annalena Baerbock appears to be signaling with some energy that she would like to, but knowing half of her base, if she were in power, if she were in a coalition, I think half of her base would try very hard to stop her. So all of that, I have to say, makes me concerned, worried. And I, on the whole, come to the conclusion that what we are probably looking at is 4 years of a transitional phase in German politics, where we will be mostly introverted, where we will be avoiding transformational change, and where ultimately we might find ourselves faced with a crisis of such existential proportions that, as per usual, the crisis forces us, rather than us trying to preempt it, by thinking about what needs to be done ourselves. In any case, I haven't received my ballot yet, so whatever happens, it won't be my fault. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Constanze, for this very inspiring statement. I have great respect for your doing the readings of the party programs. You did all your duty as a citizen. I think you at least enlightened us with, or your reading enlightened us about the situation. So thank you all for these statements. We have a number of questions, but before we want to open for the Q&A, Stephen and I would like to raise some further issues that you have touched upon. Before I hand over to Stephen, I have one big question that I would like to ask you. You all emphasized, and Sheri started with that, and Constanze ended with it. You all emphasized this big question: what is this election actually about? Is it about anything at all? Is it only about candidates? Are there any issues that matter? And you very much made it appear as this is the choice of the parties. So my question to you is, could the parties do better? Is this the mistake of the parties, or are they just reacting to modern social realities in Germany, to social change, which challenges them basically to speak to an increasingly complex and diversified electorate? And I think Constanze, in a very able way, emphasized that with respect to the Greens. The Greens had the assumption, or were under the assumption, that they really have a shot to kind of have the first Green chancellor in German history, and so they really prepared hard for that during the last 2 years. And one result of that was this new program, which deliberately, as an attempt to kind of take all the sharp edges out of the Green party ideology. So my question is, do you see a chance basically for German parties in the future to go back to, position taking and to develop clearer profiles in the way Sheri basically emphasized it in the beginning? Or can't we just conclude that this is just a new reality in German politics, that parties are to elect, which is the definition of a party in this country, and parties should no longer be manifesto parties? I wonder about your thoughts on this question. So do parties have a choice?
Thank you. I'd love to chime in with a couple questions myself. This is a fascinating panel and gives me a lot to chew on. And I also want to encourage the audience to please put your own questions in the Q&A, and in the next round, I'll read them out. So these questions are for any of the panelists, although some are more geared towards others than some. So for Thorsten, you showed this fascinating kind of gyration of the Green support being very high, over the past years, being high and then low and then high and then low. And I'd be curious to hear you reflect on who some of these swing voters might be, like who, if one can characterize them by age or education or professional status, or in any way, who are the people who are moving? It seems like the Greens gained, and then the CDU gained, and then the Greens gained, and then the SPD gained. Are these the same people, or are they kind of moved, or is it different in each phase? For Thomas, I was curious about the polling. I mean, coming from America, we've had such egregious polling challenges, and there's been kind of a consistent underreporting of people who vote on the right or people who vote for Republican. And I'm, in the U.S., and I'm curious if there's any concern about consistent polling problems in one direction or another in Germany, or if that's purely an American problem, or what some of the polling challenges are in terms of capturing this. I mean, for America, in the past 2 elections, we've been kind of surprised, right? And I'd love to hear you think kind of comparatively about polling. Sheri, for your, I was reminded of your work and this wonderful article that I assigned in What is Europe about, the changing nature of social democracy. And you talked about this at SEMS before, about how the SPD, to return to its former stature, needs to highlight material ideas or topics over kind of cultural ones. And I'm curious if you see that happening at all. I mean, one of the things that we've emphasized here is how, or that's come through, is how, this has not been an election so far about ideas, but it's about personalities. But of the topics, are any in particular playing to the SPD or not? And so that's all. Let's turn things over to you, and then I'd encourage the audience to add anything you'd like in the Q&A, and I'd be happy to read it off to the to the panelists.
Okay, I will start. There's an interesting contrast for those of us who are sort of live in the United States, but are concerned with European and German politics, that, you don't want to go too far in either direction, right? So what we have in the United States now are parties with very clearly defined profiles, right? It's called polarization, right? And there is very little overlap now in the preferences of, Republican and Democratic voters on some very important issues. And the parties themselves are even more polarized. If you look at politicians, political stances, yada, yada, yada. So the mishmash that we've all bemoaned in Germany, that is problematic for democracy, but let's be clear that going too far in the opposite direction is also very problematic, right? So you don't want parties that are completely polarized, but you don't want parties like many of my colleagues have bemoaned that are, you're not really sure, what are their solutions to contemporary challenges? What do they stand for? Are we voting for a chancellor candidate as opposed to a party? And is that chancellor candidate just the least offensive of the options, right? Both of those are not great for democracy in general, and they're not great for solving practical challenges in particular. I mean, what you'd like to see are parties that have distinct profiles that are responsive to the challenges of the day. I focused a lot on domestic politics. Constanze made me completely now want to slip my wrist about a variety of foreign policy challenges, which I haven't even really focused on, which, now I'm going to be kept up at night by. But look, how does that happen? Of course, politicians and parties have choices, but they work in particular contexts. And those contexts provide strong incentives and disincentives for certain kinds of behavior. It's very hard when you have to negotiate with two other parties, for example, to maintain a clear profile. It's also very difficult when you're coming on the heels of an extremely popular and long-serving chancellor to kind of come up with things that are, if not in direct contradiction to what that chancellor stood for, would mark a dramatic break with, where she was for obvious reasons. So absolutely politicians and parties have a chance. We do not live in a world of structural constraints where, nobody can do anything. But we also do live in a world where, again, incentives and disincentives matter. As bad as some of the challenges in Germany are, I'm living in the United States. Germany does not seem to me to be facing the same level of challenges that we have in the United States. And so it's easier, I think, for politicians to kick the can down the road, which frankly, again, as much as one admires Merkel for keeping Germany, sort of stable and relatively rational, clearly she was a champion of as well. I would not expect, given the likely election outcome, that is to say some kind of tripartite coalition, we are going to see strong profiles. None of the candidates, with the possible exception of Baerbock, who sells herself as the candidate of change, but looks increasingly unlikely to actually be chancellor, neither Laschet nor Scholz are men of big ideas. They haven't called for dramatic change. Nothing in their past suggests that they will advocate for such. And so I would expect, different versions of kind of muddling through should either of them become chancellor. Will Germany survive those 4 years? Unlike Constanze, I think it probably will. Will that be good for Germany? Will that be good for Europe? No, just surviving, probably not. But, do I think it would be better if these parties actually said, look, here's what we stand for, right? What should the SPD stand for? Look, the German economy is not in terrible shape, but there are a very large number of crappy jobs that have been created over the last 16 years. There are important social and socioeconomic divisions in Germany. There are some real economic challenges around what everybody talks about, digitization and other things. The SPD should be the party that says, look, here's what we stand for. We are going to fight to make Germany a more equitable society, to create an economy that can create good jobs for everyone, to make sure neither immigrants nor native Germans fall through the cracks, to ensure good jobs for the future, to bring German industry up to, world-beating standards, and not just rely on its traditional strengths. Yes, I would like to see the SPD stand for that and do that. Do I think that is very likely in a tripartite coalition government? I don't think so. More likely, I think, oddly, in a left government, although, again, everybody who I've spoken to who knows Germany better than I thinks that that is extremely unlikely, that the left party is just an anathema, and that the SPD, should it be given the opportunity to form a government, will not take that chance. With the FDP in government, with the Free Democrats in government, the Liberal Party, I think that you're going to see a race to the sort of watered down center that's going to be a disaster for both Germany and for the SPD.
maybe I follow up on that, and maybe I can try to link the question that Thomas has raised with your question, Stephen, that you have raised, because it basically tackles the question or touches upon the question, what's the role of parties and what's the role of candidates? I mean, this year that we experience right now is labeled as a super election year yet again, because we have seen other elections before. We started this election year with 2 state elections in the southwest of Germany, Baden-Württemberg and Rhineland-Palatinate, and we had another one in June in Sachsen-Anhalt. And I mentioned this because these 3 state elections were won by 3 very different parties, namely the Greens in Baden-Württemberg, the Social Democrats in Rhineland-Palatinate, and the Christian Democrats in Saxony-Anhalt. The combining feature is that in each of these states, the incumbent prime minister was re-elected. And I guess this is what we see as a trend in German politics in these days, in recent years, that popular incumbents really are in a very strong position. And if they don't make huge mistakes, the likelihood that they're re-elected is quite high. But we also see the trouble that parties have once these popular figures step down. So basically, if we look to Sunday, the upcoming election, you can think about this as kind of the question is actually Laschet in the incumbent position because he is the candidate for the incumbent party. Is it Scholz who is kind of the incumbent because he's the vice chancellor, he's the finance minister in this coalition? And given that Laschet has really performed, whether that's justified or not, but that's the perception that's there, performed very poorly in the campaign, it's been Scholz that has kind of filled this personnel gap that Merkel has opened up. So I guess parties are no longer that important, even though I would say I'm not so sure that previous German elections have really been driven by extremely detailed policy considerations. I mean, it's always, if you think of 98, when Schröder was elected, I mean, this was Innovation and Gerechtigkeit. Those were 2 like phrases that weren't really filled back then and were only filled once they came into power. The fascinating thing, and I'm curious whether we will see that again, I think, but that was my impression of 2017, where we also had a rather not very detailed campaign, but once the election was over and once all these talks, how do we form these complex coalitions, we saw extremely detailed policy negotiations. And this will probably be even more intense after this election because the coalition situation is so complex. So probably all the talk about issues, positions, compromises will be very detailed, but only after the Sunday election.
Maybe I go on. Thanks for the question, Thomas and Stephen. I think regarding the parties, whether they are reacting or not, I think this time, compared to the last elections, the recent 4 or 5 elections, this time I think they actually, most of the parties did quite some programmatic work before the election and, long time before the election. So they actually came to SPD and the Greens had managed to write their manifesto, well in advance of the election campaign. So they were, and they were transparent about this, the FDP as well. So they had, and I think this is maybe a good thing this time, that we actually have quite different options to choose from, right? It's not a mishmash. I think those parties stand for have different policy profiles. And of course, are they also reacting because they want to win, votes? This is part of the job of presenting a good or an interesting party profile, but you also want to win votes. And I think the Greens were in a great position to actually grab those voters that I call those the Merkel voters that are really Merkel supporters, but not supporters of the CDU per se. And by the way, these are lots of women voters who vote for Merkel, but would never, or maybe not never, but at least have no proclivity to vote for the CDU. So the Greens have been in a great position to actually grab those voters and make them an offer, because, you know, the CDU does not offer more than, you know, female voters. I'm not sure that they don't have, so the CDU does not have a party profile, you know, substantively. And the leading figures of the CDU are not people, I think they are quite attractive for female voters, you know, modern female voters to vote for. So they are, you know, they don't have a good chance in getting this. But the Greens really messed this up in terms of the campaign. And so the SPD actually figured out, so how do we actually have a chance in getting more votes? You know, we just need to make clear, you know, we need to frame the narrative of the campaign in a way that it's really about who will become the successor of Angela Merkel, right? Because it was never the case that Armin Laschet was seen as a legitimate successor, at least of those supporters of the Merkel voters that really voted for Merkel because of her. Laschet is not the type of guy that is similar to Merkel in any dimension. I mean, they are both in the CDU, but that's about it. You know, so I think the Greens were really in a good position, but they just didn't. I mean, maybe they need to learn how to run, you know, a chancellor campaign or something. I mean, this is still a party used to hang out together, you know, think about cool actions or whatever in an office, but they don't run a professional campaign. I mean, this is, you know, unbearable to see, really, you know, how, you know, which great chances they had and they messed it up so badly. And the SPD still, you know, at least know how to run a good campaign, even though they were not really strong before, but at least they know how to run campaigns. And I think they're pretty successful in that. I want to also respond to the idea that so I'm actually more positive about this all coalition thing. I agree that, you know, when you form a coalition agreement, that you have to give in stuff. And so to some degree, this is a watering down. But also when you know, on the campaign trail, you, of course, factor this in and you are more extreme in terms of the positions you take than at the end of the day. So you have still room to maneuver in those coalition negotiations. And, you know, just looking at other countries who are also used to have coalition governments, you know, they are still alive and they still run decent countries like Sweden, Denmark. You know, the Netherlands will get in trouble at some point, but, you know, so they don't have a government yet. It's still a caretaker government. But, you know, coalition governments are not per se, you know, the end of the world of a democratic country. So I would think that, you know, given the experience the parties have especially in conducting coalition governance, right? So you need to give some policy priorities to coalition partners that everyone can actually, you know, brag a little bit. I did this, right? And I'm the one who is responsible for this. And this is if you, and Merkel was pretty good at that, you know, and there are other, you know, at the state governments, there are also those state governors that rely on coalition governance. Some of them are really good in giving their coalition partner fair share of publicity and you know, and policy as well. So I think it really depends on how they actually govern together. And my sense is that, you know, at least Scholz and Laschet both can actually do this. So I'm not worried about that at all. Last point about Stephen's point regarding the polling problems. I think this is, for Germany, this is first world problem. There's not a situation like in the US where you have, you know, lots of machines calling people or pushing them in one direction or the other. I mean, we have a shy AfD vote type of thing, but now there's more experience with this. So I'm pretty sure they nail the FDP AfD vote pretty well in the polls. So I'm not too worried. I mean, sometimes you miss a party with 3 or 4%, but hey, given the uncertainty that you have in polling people, you don't reach everyone, right? This has to be expected. So maybe it's more a matter of adapting our expectations, how precise those poll numbers can be, rather than that we really have a serious polling problem. Thanks.
Constanze, would you like to chime in, or should I open things up to the Q&A? Okay. So we have a number of questions which I'll pose to the panelists. Some have been covered already. Starting with from anonymous, there are a couple anonymous ones. Do you think there will be any surprising coalitions? Or I guess I'd rephrase that. What would be the most surprising coalition outcome in this election? Then from Christian Fahrenbach, I'd like to learn more about Sheri's remark regarding the candidate's image dominating this campaign rather than policy ideas. What is, from the panelists' point of view, the reason that the discussion of policy ideas remains so superficial? The urgency of the pandemic, the climate crisis, the transformation of an aging and still too little digitized society playing really just small roles. Why have ideas remained so unimportant? Then from Kyle Scheibunko, he's asking about in Bavaria, where the CSU can no longer form single-party governments, what does the decline of the CSU in particular mean for the future of the CDU and the Union? And is it possible we'll start seeing other parties winning constituency seats in Bavaria, or will the CSU maintain its dominance? From Martin Kraus, if the next government, most likely a coalition of 3 parties, might be a transitional government, to what will it transition to? That's a good question. And is it likely that such a government further postpones necessary reforms to the Bundestag size and transparency, among other issues, which might further deteriorate or erode the trust that Germans have in government? And then from another anonymous attendee, on German social media, young liberal and political voices believe that Scholz will win because he kept a low profile on many topics, while the other 2 were more opinionated and more outspoken, and hence polarized voters. Is this a realistic assessment? And I think the last one from Kevin, reflecting on crises, if these crises force us and Germany to react to them, how do you think the candidates will respond to solve these challenges? And who do you think is the most prepared to meet these challenges? Again, we've already covered this to a certain extent, but it'd be wonderful to hear you all reflect on that. So if you could each take maybe 1 or 2 minutes very briefly, since we're almost out of time, to respond to those. Anything that jumped out at you, and then I'll wrap things up at the end. Thanks.
Do you want us to go in order, or what should we do, Stephen?
Sure. Yeah, Sheri, that seems most organized. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so then I'll begin. I think the most unusual or sort of surprising coalition in many ways would be the one that is, in some ways, at least according to the current polls, the most logical, which is a left-wing coalition consisting of the SPD, the Greens, and the Left Party. Why would that be the most unusual? First of all, it would be historically unprecedented. We haven't had one of those before. It would be a clearly left-wing coalition, and so it might have the potential to kind of reorient German politics along a much clearer left-right dimension. It opens up the possibility of tackling at least somewhat more forthrightly some of Germany's economic challenges. These three parties do not hold all exactly the same priorities, but they are sort of to the left on economic issues. The Greens in particular have clarified their positions on a whole variety of economic challenges. And this would be, again, I think, a very interesting coalition because it would give Germany, a clear left-right divide. And that might have some positive implications, both politically and as far as dealing with Germany's economic challenges is concerned. Again, those who know even more about German politics than I do really think that the left party remains an anathema, in particular because of some of its foreign policy positions. As someone more focused on domestic policy, I find those positions to be extremely problematic, but likely more of symbolic value at this point than anything else. Nobody thinks Germany's going to leave NATO, yada, yada, yada. But okay, I don't know. But that would be my answer to that. Two of the questions actually point in contradictory directions. One asked about the lack of positions taken by the candidates, and the other at the end, the anonymous one said, is it the case that Scholz has done better because Laschet and Baerbock have taken more polarizing positions? I would thread the needle between those two observations, which obviously contradict each other in some ways, by saying my observation is it's not so much that the candidates haven't talked about the climate challenge, haven't talked about digitization, haven't talked about others. It's just that they've taken really quite, I would say, indistinct, unimaginative responses to them, again, with the possible exception of Baerbock, who's obviously very passionate, particularly about climate issues. So to my mind, there are a lot of issues that haven't been discussed, and I think a lot of them actually fall more in Constanze's bailiwick. Obviously Europe faces some really major challenges. The idea that you're just going to blow past the anti-democratic, to some degree revisionist aspirations of China and Russia, like that Germany can afford not to confront those things, that just strikes me as head in the sand policy, like of the nth degree. But I think really what we've had is, again, a sort of, a watery down, mushy-mashy kind of response rather than so much direct avoidance. I would say that's more true on the domestic front than the foreign policy front, where I do agree, like these kinds of issues seem to me to have been woefully absent from German debate, although again, in a lot of countries, including the United States, people just do not care as much about foreign policy issues. And so if you can avoid them, politicians often will. But what I think is most remarkable, again, is, the lack of clear profile, imaginative and daring responses to the challenges that do exist, not an ignoring of them all, but rather an inability to sort of confront the fact that the time has come for something more than the muddling through that we've had for some time now, and some really imaginative, clear-cut responses to some very significant challenges.
Thanks for the questions. I'll try to be brief. The most surprising coalition maybe could be a continuation of the one we actually have right now, maybe with a change in the lead. But because, we talked about this, the hurdles for all the other coalitions are quite substantial and significant. And we might see situations where they just won't form at the end of the day. And then this so-called grand coalition of Christian and Social Democrats might be kind of the last coalition standing. So, just a surprising coalition, but nonetheless, maybe a not completely unrealistic one. Will the CSU lose constituencies in Bavaria? Yes, probably. Munich, for example, might go to either Greens or Social Democrats. Other university cities might see a rise for the Greens, and especially like if Social Democrats and Greens were able to coordinate their sort of district campaigns, they would easily be in a position to win districts, but they don't do it. I can easily say that, of course, please do coordinate, knowing that it's how difficult that would be for the parties. But if, the CSU right now in the polls is like at 30% for Bavaria, that's 5% nationwide. So it would be easy for not easy, but possible for Social Democrats and Greens together to receive 30% of the vote and win seats in districts, but it's not happening really right now. And final point, it's interesting how Scholz is characterized here. I mean, he's one of the most popular politicians in Germany, and he has been one of those most popular politicians in Germany for a while, actually. And all other parties, especially the Christian Democrats, have really put the pressure on him. I mean, 3 scandals are supposedly related to him. So I don't really see that there's a low profile here. I mean, what is probably the difference between him on the one hand and Laschet and Baerbock on the other hand is that he is seen as an experienced minister at the federal level. I mean, keep in mind, Baerbock at the outset of this year, January, February 2021, had a recognition rate. About 50% of Germans knew her. So what that means is that she had an image that was not clearly defined, that was easily shaped by positive things when she was nominated as the candidate, but also given all the mistakes that have characterized her campaign, also led to a complete deterioration of her image. I mean, she's not seen as competent. She's not seen as credible. And so Scholz is kind of a clear contrast to Laschet as well as Baerbock, who, I mean, Laschet is the most unpopular candidate in Germany right now. It's just his image is so bad that it's really easy for Scholz to be there as a strong, credible, solid leader. And he has, I mean, they have, and maybe that's a contrast to the last grand coalition in which the SPD was a junior partner. They have made some smart strategic moves in these most recent 4 years with respect to taxing the rich and stuff like that. So it's not only that he's experienced, but he can quite credibly present himself as a social democratic candidate.
All right. So what's the most surprising coalition? I have another proposal. But I like that. I actually wrote this down. This was my first one, the SPD-CDU coalition. But you know, there's another proposal I have, namely a red-green government, if they actually turn out to get a majority. So we predict currently a 11% chance. That's not high, but you know, maybe because. The reason is, if they get a majority, they will form it no matter what. I mean, they come to grips. I mean, they are fairly close. Now, if this happens, what Thorsten and others said, that, you know, all those coalition negotiations fall, you know, they cannot come to an agreement, then why not, as a surprising other coalition, a minority coalition of the red-green? So we would get a red-green government, and they try to govern with changing majorities, you know, in foreign policy, maybe more with the FDP, in for social policy, more with the left party. Maybe this is possible. I don't know. So there was this question about the role of the FDP. And my sense is, you know, they used to be the kingmaker. They are, again, a kingmaker, but not alone anymore. So they and the Greens are essentially telling us, or will decide, you know, which government coalition we will get, right? So if they both, you know, and this would be actually my wish if those coalition negotiations should speed up, you know, my suggestion would be to have both parties first talk to one another and figure out what they want, and then, you know, make a proposal. Either then they are the kingmakers, right? Either CDU and CSU with Laschet, or go to Olaf Scholz with the SPD. But this would speed up the process. I'm not sure if this is realistic, but you know, that's what it could be, I think. The other question I want to, you know, say something to about the decline of the CSU. You know, Thorsten mentioned this already. It's really hard right now for other parties to negotiate, to essentially coordinate their campaigns. But if we would, so in terms of getting an XXL Bundestag, right? If we go out and tell people, vote with this, you know, every CSU supporter should vote with a second vote for her party, but not vote for the CSU with their first vote, then we would shrink, other parties would actually gain constituency seats. And this is the last word. And the Bundestag will shrink in the numbers. It will not explode like this. So if you're from Bavaria, don't vote for the CSU with the first vote. You can nevertheless vote with the CSU for the second vote. This is really the vote that counts, but not with the first vote. Now I'm shutting up.
Do you still want me to say something, or are we out of time?
Oh, yes, please. I mean, people can leave if they if they have to, but if you...
Okay, I'll make it very briefly. Since we're sort of going out on a limb with surprising coalitions, how about this? First-time voters under 30 are so pissed off with the performance of the Grand Coalition and with the campaign and with the disappointing showing on the whole of the Greens. That they end up voting for, because they're still, their absolute priority is climate change. They vote with a sigh for the Greens. Some of them will vote for the Liberals, and a surprising number of them will vote for the Trans-European Party vote. I'm not saying they could form a coalition, but a significant role for the citrus colors and a just incredibly surprising entry for a trans-European list would, I think, mix up your German politics quite considerably. So I'm just going to put that out there as something that would be fun to watch. That said, I think our German compatriots are perfectly capable of voting for stability and ending up with red-green. Now, on the foreign and security policy, nobody asked questions about that, but I will just say one last thing. And that's this. We Germans, whether we're here in America where I am or in Germany, like to moan about the Americans being the 800-pound gorilla, that doesn't pay attention to, that even if it's just turning over in its sleep at night, that has an impact on everybody else in the world. On the evidence of this German election campaign, what Germany still doesn't understand is that in Europe, it is America. It is the 800-pound gorilla. And our actions or inactions, as Radek Sikorski, then Polish foreign minister, once famously said in 2011, have consequences beyond our borders. And our friends and neighbors are even more worried by our inaction than by our actions. And that's the thing. We don't have the luxury of pretending that we're an island, not an Ireland, but that's also an island. And I think it is increasingly concerning and somewhat offensive to our neighbors to hear us pretend that we are. And I'll leave it at that. I think that's a problem.
All right, thank you so much. I think since we're out of time, I will skip concluding. I'd love to hear all your comments about the surprising coalitions. I'm going to keep them in mind as I watch the elections. I want to thank you all for coming for this event with co-sponsored by the Deutsches Haus and the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies at NYU. Thank you all the panelists and everybody for organizing, for attending. And we'll see you all again at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.